Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today our mission is to cut through all the noise, all the misinformation, and get to the heart of the biggest diplomatic story of the year.
It's a huge one. We're talking about the sudden, and I mean really extraordinary, move toward peace negotiations in the Ukraine-Russia conflict as we're heading into the end of 2025.
Right. And it's more than just a diplomatic event, isn't it? It feels more like a diplomatic shockwave.
That's the perfect word for it. The whole world is trying to get its head around this unexpected U.S. proposal, a massive 28-point peace framework. And this document, it's done more than just open a door to dialogue.
It's exposed some really deep cracks.
Exactly. Tectonic fissures, not just between Kyiv and Moscow, which you'd expect, but, and this is the key insight from the reports, between Washington and its most important European allies.
And that's the core tension we really need to explore here. I mean, the central question that hangs over this whole moment is this U.S. proposal the genuine start of the war's end?
Or is it something else?
Or are we just watching the opening moves of a new high-stakes geopolitical power game?
Yeah.
One that's maybe designed more to meet Washington's domestic needs, potentially at the expense of its partners.
And you know, what makes this such a turning point for 21st century conflict is the sheer scale of the historical precedent that's at risk here.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the global system we've had since World War II, it's all built on the principle of non-aggression, of state sovereignty. If this war ends on terms that legitimize using military force to just seize land,
Even in the name of peace.
right, even for the sake of peace, it sets an incredibly dangerous standard. It means the actual rules of the global order are, right now, on the negotiating table.
So to unpack this really complex landscape, we've been digging into comprehensive international reports, analyzing all the strategic moves, the political leaks, and the immense pressure points around this U.S.-led framework. We're going straight into the details. Okay, let's get right into it. On the surface, the U.S. proposes a peace plan. That should be a good headline everywhere. So why did this framework cause such a massive political tremor, especially in places like Kyiv and Brussels?
Because the framework didn't really come from Washington, not purely. The core surprise, the thing that caused the immediate shock, was the leak. And it's been confirmed by multiple sources now.
The leak that said what?
That the U.S. proposal was heavily influenced by, if not directly based on, a non-official Russian document, a papier, that was sent from Moscow back in October.
Wow. That's just strategically bewildering. The U.S. is Ukraine's #1 backer, financially, militarily. So for them to base a peace effort on a Russian document, it suggests a complete strategic pivot.
It does.
Why would Washington risk so much political capital on this? Was this some kind of deliberate trial balloon?
The source material suggests a couple of possibilities. One, it was seen inside the administration as the only realistic starting point that Russia might even consider just to get talks started.
Okay, so a pragmatic, if cynical, start.
Exactly. And the second, more cynical view is that it let certain U.S. actors signal to Moscow, and just as importantly, to their voters at home, that they were serious about ending the war. They showed a willingness to compromise, even if it was on behalf of Kyiv. The goal was just starting the talks, no matter what was in the initial draft.
And what was in that initial draft was overtly pro-Moscow. Let's dig into the 4 key elements that really defined it, because these are the details that just fundamentally changed the whole geopolitical calculation.
Precisely. So first, the draft suggested explicitly limiting the size and the scope of the Ukrainian military.
So it's not just about troop numbers.
No. It's about neutralizing Ukraine as a future security threat to Russia, basically forcing it into a permanently demilitarized status.
Which undermines their ability to defend themselves down the road without, external guarantees.
Exactly. Then, the second element. It called for recognizing a special status for Russian-occupied territories. This is a really crucial legalistic move.
How so?
It's not explicitly ceding sovereignty, but special status would create a permanent, internationally recognized gray zone where Kyiv's legal authority is basically zero. It maintains a perpetual source of conflict and, of course, Russian influence.
The third point, I imagine, goes right to the heart of what started this whole thing. NATO.
It explicitly blocked Ukraine's entry into NATO, period. This was Moscow's central, non-negotiable demand from day one. By putting that in the draft, the U.S. was signaling it was willing to completely restructure European security to accommodate Russian fears. That is a red line for so many NATO members.
And the fourth point, which I have to imagine was the absolute hardest for Kyiv to even read.
It was. It was the explicit acceptance of Russian sovereignty over certain Ukrainian territories. This wouldn't just be a loss of land, it would be the first time a major Western-aligned power validated acquiring territory through a full-scale invasion in decades.
So unsurprisingly, that brought fierce Ukrainian objection.
Wow, immediately. And the source material confirms this part was adjusted later on, but the political damage was already done, globally.
The leak itself was the damage. It made European allies sit up and ask, is the U.S. just trying to end this war on its own political timeline, or are they actively undermining our long-term interests, our core legal principles?
It absolutely shattered trust.
So we understand the European outrage. But to get the full picture, we have to shift our focus. Why on earth did Washington put forward a proposal they knew would cause this kind of rupture? You have to follow the political drivers back to the U.S.
And this move was deeply, maybe even primarily rooted in internal American political pressure.
I was going to say, this has domestic politics written all over it.
It does. The framework was allegedly designed to be sellable to powerful leaders in the U.S. who were, frankly, desperate for the image of a war ender. They needed a political win, a way to close this incredibly expensive chapter before the next election cycle.
And that reflects a growing fatigue in Congress, doesn't it? When you look at the raw numbers, these multi-billion-dollar aid packages, the pressure to shift focus back home becomes, well, at least understandable.
Of course. And you have surveys showing more and more Americans questioning the cost, especially when things like persistent high inflation are dominating the news at home.
So the cost of war translates directly into a diplomatic shift.
Yes. Washington was signaling, maybe cruelly, that the spigot of endless financial support could be turned off, and likely would be. That pressure became a key lever to force Kyiv to the negotiating table.
But this whole approach put Washington in a serious political minefield with Europe. I mean, Europe's response was diplomatic on the surface, yes, but it was incredibly critical underneath.
Deeply unhappy. That's the phrase that comes up again and again. Many EU leaders felt the U.S. was making these huge decisions about Europe's future without any real transparent consultation. It felt like a massive breach of Allied protocol.
And Europe's core concern was just existential, right?
Completely. The European Commission put out this very stern warning, saying any deal that involves territorial division, even if you call it peace, would be seen as validating the destruction of a sovereign European state.
They see it through the lens of their own history.
Absolutely. Accepting military conquest as a legitimate tool rewrites the entire post-World War II security architecture that they built. So if Washington is prioritizing a quick exit and Brussels is prioritizing international law,
you've got a clear, very dangerous tension between allies.
And that tension means that even if a ceasefire happens, the political cohesion of the entire Western alliance is now severely strained. They might agree on the goal of peace, but they are diametrically opposed on what the cost of that peace should be.
So let's turn to Kyiv. If the framework was so tilted toward Moscow, and if it created all this friction with Washington's allies, why did Ukraine even signal it was ready to consider it? What does this mean for their strategic survival?
For Ukraine, agreeing to even enter this conversation was framed by their leadership as a strategic necessity. It was not a sign of weakness or that surrender was coming. They were just caught between overwhelming external pressure and a brutal internal reality.
Okay, let's start with the external pressure, because that seems like the most immediate threat.
It was. The sources are clear that the #1 fear in Kyiv was the imminent risk of U.S. aid just slowing down to a trickle.
And if Washington, their main supplier, pulls back?
The EU nations simply couldn't fill that gap. The source material notes they're facing their own acute pressures, the energy crisis, war weariness among their populations. They couldn't support Ukraine's war effort alone long-term. Kyiv knew its window for full, cohesive Western support was closing fast.
And then there's the crushing reality on the ground itself, which the reports make pretty clear was getting more and more dire.
Yes. I mean, the battlefield reality demanded a pause. Ukraine was facing heavy troop losses, and at the same time, severe, crippling shortages of weapons and ammunition.
We're talking air defense, artillery shells.
The essentials. They had to open the door to talks, to just try and stop the bleeding, to halt the damage before their forces were completely exhausted, and the situation became strategically irreparable.
But we have to address this paradox that the sources mention. While these very sensitive peace talks are supposedly happening in Geneva, Russia ramps up missile attacks on Kyiv and other cities. Why intensify the fighting while you're talking about peace?
It's a classic brutal strategy. Analysts are calling it the big storm before the calm.
Okay.
Russia's motivation is straightforward. They're using this period to inflict the maximum amount of pain, of damage, to pressure Ukraine into negotiating from a position of profound weakness. They want to show that even at the negotiating table, they still hold the tactical upper hand and can escalate whenever they want.
And yet, even facing all of that, the political line from Kyiv is defiant. How do they balance that need for a strategic pause with President Zelensky's unbending commitment to a just peace?
It's a calculated risk. President Zelensky has been very clear that a just peace means they are not interested in a paper peace.
An agreement that doesn't hold up.
Exactly. An agreement without concrete, enforceable security guarantees. They know that without something like a NATO structure protecting them, this war will simply start again whenever Russia decides the time is right. So the strategic necessity of talking is balanced by this existential demand for real, durable security.
Okay, let's move to the very heart of this deadlock. When you look at the actual negotiations, what are the non-negotiables? The red lines for both sides that make consensus seem almost impossible right now.
They are just fundamentally diametrically opposed. They reflect two entirely different visions for what that region should look like. Let's start with Russia's core demands, which are all about what they call security and, of course, immediate territorial gain.
Security first, from their perspective.
From their perspective, Moscow requires a clear, permanent, internationally binding ban on Ukraine ever joining NATO. That's number one. Beyond that, they demand permanent, internationally recognized sovereignty over all four of the annexed territories: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson.
These haven't changed at all since the invasion began.
Not one bit. They see the recognition of these gains as their political victory.
And on the other side, Ukraine's red lines are founded on sovereignty and justice first.
And for them, these are non-negotiable for their actual national survival. They require a complete Russian withdrawal from all occupied lands, and that includes Crimea, as a precondition for any final deal.
And they still demand those security guarantees.
Robust, legally enforceable, NATO-like guarantees. We're talking commitments on air defense, intelligence sharing, long-term funding, even if they can't get full Article 5 membership right away. And crucially, establishing an international justice process for the invasion. For Ukraine, ceding territory isn't just a loss, it's political suicide. It means validating the aggressor's entire strategy.
So the word peace itself just holds fundamentally different meanings for them. Moscow sees peace as cementing its gains. Kyiv sees it as restoring its territory and getting justice.
It's not just a political disagreement. It's a conflict over the very definition of statehood in the 21st century. And that leaves very, very little common ground, at least right now.
Which is why the world is starting to look beyond the two main combatants.
Yeah.
I mean, if they can't agree, who else steps in to try and bridge this enormous gap?
And we are seeing the roles of these secondary powers shifting dramatically as they try to shape the outcome.
So who are the new pivotal players emerging in this geopolitical scaffolding?
China, for one, is definitely increasing its diplomatic engagement. It's positioning itself as a potential mediator.
Which allows Beijing to project this image of a responsible global power.
Right, while at the same time strengthening its financial and political ties with Moscow. The sources suggest China is really leveraging Russia's isolation to its own advantage, securing resource and infrastructure deals.
What about Turkey? They've acted as a key facilitator before, especially with the grain deal.
Turkey is signaling it's ready to re-engage, to host future peace meetings. It's a chance for Ankara to capitalize on its unique geopolitical position, straddling NATO and Russia. It reinforces their role as an indispensable regional broker, especially with the Black Sea and those grain corridors levers they know both sides desperately need.
And all of this brings us back to the ultimate global stakes. The final outcome here is going to define the geopolitical landscape for decades to come.
Absolutely. The stakes could not be higher. If Russia benefits from this, if the final deal, either explicitly or implicitly, legitimizes using military force to seize land, it sends a global signal.
That makes right.
Precisely. And that could encourage territorial disputes in every other volatile region on the planet.
But conversely, if Ukraine prevails on its core principles, territorial integrity, justice, what does that confirm for the world order?
It would confirm the enduring power of the liberal international order, that foundational principle of non-aggression. If Kyiv manages to preserve its sovereignty, forcing Russia to either retreat or face massive consequences, it proves that collective defense against this kind of military conquest can still work.
So what this deep dive really shows us is that the U.S. 28-point proposal It's not just a piece of paper. It's a new, incredibly complex battleground for global power. And it involves so many more variables: internal U.S. politics, the rift with European allies, the calculations of powers like China and Turkey, than just Russia and Ukraine.
And that complexity leads to a sobering thought. The decisions made by just a handful of leaders in these next few weeks will determine whether the world accepts a new paradigm where major military conquest actually pays off, or if the old order of state sovereignty prevails. The outcome here will literally dictate the rules for the next several decades of international relations.
Keep tracking this decisive moment. Thank you for joining the Deep Dive.